There's a book called Impro by Keith Johnstone I read a long time ago. It's ostensibly about improv comedy, but it's been recommended by economists and philosophers and other very serious people. And the first chapter is on status, social status. And I think most people think of that book as being more about status. It's easier to sort of comprehend that, even though that's a bit revelatory for a lot of people. I think it was for me at the time. But I think the real reason everyone thinks that they love the book because of status, interactions, explained, revealed. But really, I think a lot of it is about intuition. It's not about performing the status maneuver. It's about performing it intuitively. That's what Johnstone's on about the whole time. Except he doesn't think of it in terms, he doesn't seem to be too precise about it. I think he was onto something, he knew he was on something. He'd seen for himself what it did to people, how it fascinated them, how it was fun and funny and so forth. But I don't think he managed to articulate to the audience how much it was about intuition rather than about creativity. I mean, it is about creativity, but you can't just tell someone, do it the creative way, do it the alive way, do it organically. What does that mean? And he had all these exercises to get people to be intuitive. But I don't think he generalized. He didn't generalize across his principles and say, look, here is an abstraction that describes a regularity in intuitive actions in a wide variety of contexts. In that sense, I think it's probably still underappreciated. Well, so what do I have to say about intuition? In the introduction to the book, Johnstone writes a few paragraphs. Well, he writes a bunch about it. He writes some amount about his life, and I read a few paragraphs of it a week or so ago. And for the first time in my life, it actually worked the way he always said it did. When I read in his thing that he had his students point at stuff and call it the wrong name, and then everything becomes more vibrant, alive, colorful. The people appear bigger or smaller. The room is bigger or smaller. There's a whole new perspective. I tried it a few times and nothing happened. I suspect this is connected to what I've termed my anti-placebo tendency. I don't mostly notice effects from caffeine. I assume I do have them, but they haven't been detectable for me. I talked with Kat once, and she was like, what? No, don't do that. Don't have an anti-placebo thing. I'm carefully checking my experience, carefully avoiding confirmation bias, priming, so forth. I get, at the end of the very controlled process, the answer is, I don't see anything. And she's like, don't ruin it. Yes, caffeine is real, but placebos are real. It is a real effect. And if you can have a positive placebo effect, embrace it, enjoy it. Stop trying to look on suspicion with every sensation and bleed it from anything that may not be, the results of a temporary stimulant like caffeine. It's no, you're not always going to know exactly which bit of sensation is from this or that. You may not be able to see it clearly in that way, but if you just lean into it, you feel into it, you expect to be more energized, you'll probably find it and enjoy it. I haven't tried this yet, but maybe I should. I did try Keith Johnstone's thing. I didn't do the calling stuff the wrong name. What I actually did was just look at the world. I was the passenger in a car. I looked out the window, and how did I do it? The thing is that stuff did become more vibrant. Things became more magical, and I mean that sort of technically, because they became more anthropomorphized. One way to say it is that I must have been projecting agency onto everything, but in my actual experience, what it was just that, things were, as I said, they were brighter, more vivid, more fascinating, they were interesting. I saw, leaning trees that one of the thoughts that came to mind was that they were cheering or supporting. I saw other trees that looked like weird, bony, skeletal fingers in the distance. I saw little splashes of color, and I can't say that I remember exactly what I thought about them, but the flavor of the thing would have been something like, I had the impression, that's not where, I didn't have it, I experienced the impression of them being sort of for me, of them being purposeful, intended, somehow meaningful, relevant to my own existence. I went through a few pages of an old book it was just a huge book, it was just a list, a giant list, it was a book-sized list, and it was just a list of superstitions from, I think, ancient Europe. And everything meant something. Everything you saw in the world was purposeful, meaningful, it meant something for you. It was a magical world. Mythological. Anthropomorphized. Well, and that made it very interesting and fascinating, I bet, and colorful and vivid, the way that I was able to experience. And as I did this in the car, I realized it reminded me of some of my childhood experiences. And Keith Johnstone talks about children in some cases. And I don't think it's that this is the realm of childhood. I think it's the realm of intuition. I think it's the realm of probably, I'm using these terms what are terms I'm using really loosely? Like right brain, left brain, system 1, system 2, intuition versus analysis. I'm basically synonymizing these dichotomies. That may be invalid, but whatever. So I don't think it's the realm of childhood. There's nothing magical. God, we have this idea in our culture that magic is in childhood. It's like, no, magic is an intuition. And children still do intuition because they haven't yet been socialized. They haven't yet been is enculturated? Is enculturated a word? But the peculiarities of our culture have not yet been properly written upon the tables of their heart, if you will. So they sort of have a more naturally balanced perspective on the world, naturally balanced. And then, up in the West, and this happened to me as I grew up, and it happens to others, is you get better and better at analysis, at system 2, at left brain thinking. And as that gets trained up, the other thing, it's not so much that you're taught against the other thing explicitly, maybe you are, probably sometimes you are. But the point I'm making is, in theory, you could explain the imbalance simply by imbalanced training. You could imagine people avoiding intuition simply because they didn't really know how to engage with it. That might not be enough on its own. They might, try and fail and experiment and eventually learn, if that was the whole of the situation. But if they simultaneously don't know how to use intuition and do know how to use analysis, then maybe they just stop using intuition. And again, this intuition, obviously extremely vague. But I expect that, we'll look at what Johnstone reported. A lot of his students had this relatively flatter, less meaningful conception or experience of the world, let's say. And it's not just nature, right? It was the room, it was a building they were in, it was other people. So I think I might have been somewhat of an exceptional? I think I might have been somewhat above average in my tendency to imbalancedly favor analysis over intuition. But I don't think it's just me. It seems that Johnstone is reporting that this is actually pretty universal across people. Maybe even those who use intuition don't use it as a sort of automatic background thing that vivifies things that are otherwise they don't matter, right? Maybe you don't want to project or anthropomorphize your car too much, because you need to be able to treat it like a machine in an efficacious way. But why not anthropomorphize, the trees of the forest as you pass by? That seems relatively harmless and it's more fun. I told Kat what was happening, and she said that sounded like her experience. I talked about the personalities, the narrative, the anthropomorphization. She was like, yeah, that's what it's like for me. The colors, all of it. Another thing I've noticed is, so Kat taught me to do this thing where, I forget what she said the trigger was, but one of the things she recommended was to like, I don't remember if she said it this way, but the end technique that I'm currently using is that I imagine question marks all around the other person. I sort of remind myself that I don't know what's going on with them. And that sort of instinctively kicks in my observations. I become very attentive, and, well, then the downstream result is that I'm more perceptive, certainly. It's often hard to know what to do when you're going from not engaged to, like, remembering to look, be curious, remember your ignorance, try to sync up, try to understand, try to observe. But it's a lot easier to avoid doing things you shouldn't do, because the other person will just tell you. They'll just frown or disengage, you know? She taught me to do this. That was immediately efficacious. And I found myself remembering more easily to ask myself, at any given time, I've sort of got an idea of what I want to do next. And the thing I really want to remember is that I'm not necessarily going to do it. It doesn't matter that I have a plan. I want to be ready to move. I want to be able to move, in fact, at a moment's notice. I want to be able to respond without even knowing what I'm going to do. This is something it seems, maybe this is a little bit what it would have been nice if Johnstone had sort of figured out how to articulate. What is, like, the signal, the sign that I should act? I've been able to do it, but I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to articulate it. Because basically what I could say right now is that sort of like Bruce Lee, you become watchful and observational, and maybe you have a sense of your, like, say, your values, your wider values, right? You remember the wider context. Here you are, a human being. There is another human being. You're in a building. You have lives. You have things you like, want, whatever. And all of that gets lost sometimes as people get more and more in the context of a conversation. The more they get in the moment, the less they stay in the world. And the more their strategies are informed by the limited domain of the immediate, let's say, local context, and the less they are informed by the broader context. I think this is basically how people end up doing things that seem incredibly stupid and silly. The answer is, well, it made sense at the time. I mean, also there's the fact that intuition is not a perfectly reliable generator of good answers. If you decide to just act and you don't have a plan, yeah, like 85% of the time, it'll be pretty good, but like, you definitely need to be ready for that 15% where you just say something dumb and it's like, well, didn't think that one through. Let me try to put that another way. There seems to be this idea that, like Bruce Lee, you watch. This is one of the reasons, I don't think I noticed this before, but I think you could make a pretty strong case that one of the symbols of Bruce Lee is his eyes. You probably could have posters of, just a few, like, inches above and below his eyes. And that would be meaningful to people in a way that, a similar image of, I don't know, like a random singer wouldn't be, because their eyes aren't really a symbol of them. But Bruce Lee, his symbol was in part his eyes, because the eyes are the best tool for syncing up with the other person in a lot of ways. And as he says, you must not become still but ready. And I wonder if that's a little bit the answer, and only a little bit, but still a little bit the answer to the question of what is the signal that I should intuitively act? And the answer is something like, you're not still until you act. You are ready to act all the time, and sometimes the act you are deliberately choosing is not to speak. That is also an action. And if your intuition is telling you not to speak, then you are responding to its signal when you're still watching and waiting. Which is going to make a lot of sense if the other person is talking, except, in the occasional situation where it would make sense to interrupt them. But yeah, your intuition is guiding you. When you're sitting there not knowing what to do, you are doing it. You're sitting and watching and syncing up with them and being attentive. And then when the moment comes, somehow you know. And what is it you know? And the answer is very little, but still something. That's what intuition can do for you. If you start, imagine that you have to sort of solve the complicated puzzle that is a conversation. And imagine you're starting out at 0% synchronized deeply with the other person. And with the full moment, with the full context. Well, with so many choices to choose between, you may not know what to do. Your intuition also may not know what to do until you narrow things down. So, when you're starting at 0%, you can get distracted by this ideal of reaching 100% deeply, intimately synchronized with another person, such that your souls are basically touching. I think that's probably what human connection is. It's fine, exceptionally fine differentiation that fits like a key to a lock to them, and thus it's necessarily co-created. Even if the lock doesn't know how to contribute and they're just sitting there, they still know that they contributed to the ultimate design of the key because the key was based on the shape of the lock. And of course, in real life, when two people are dialoguing, syncing up, it's going to be a co-created sort of fine differentiation in which you are treating them the way it makes sense to treat them, not the way it makes sense to treat people, not the way it makes sense to act in general. No, you're treating them, the individual, the way it makes sense to treat them. And if that means breaking some of your regularities, your patterns, you figure that out on the fly as you sync to them. As you notice yourself having a plan, like an old recycled solution that worked in a variety of situations, and you're like, maybe I'll do this when it's my turn to talk. And then the moment sort of comes and goes. If you remember to be like, what do I want here? What is valuable here? What is there for me here? Should I just walk away? No, there's something for me here. And then it's like, okay, keep an eye on that more often. And when you have an idea to recycle an old solution, well, check it. Check if it actually seems like it will move you toward your target. If it'll move you towards something valuable, or you might even say sometimes it would make sense to aim in the direction of synchronization. Will this contribute to synchronization? Because often what happens is you're in a conversation, and the other person starts a sentence, they say something, you're like, oh nice, I'm going to talk about this when they're done. They get to the end of their sentence, you had that idea to speak when you did, and it probably made sense at the time. And when I say at the time, I mean at the exact moment you thought of it. When they said the first part of their sentence, and you were like, oh, maybe this would make sense. I think what's happening is you've detected a regularity. You've been like, oh, they're talking about knitting. I've had a lot of success when we talk about knitting by mentioning this story about my aunt or something. They're talking about knitting now. When they finish, I'm going to tell the story of my aunt, and they'll love it because that's worked so well for me in the past. And it's like, that's not bad. That's fine to have that kind of idea, to recycle that. But then you can't fuse to it. You can't clench or grip. You can't be like, this is my target, to say the thing and have them love it. You have to be like, no. The target is always to achieve something you actually care about, sort of like as a terminal value, as an intrinsic value. That's Katz's term. I said, and I think this still sort of sounds right to me, that especially if you're going to call the other one instrumental value, intrinsic value is probably a better name than terminal. I forget the name of terminal values we're used to more than I forgot instrumental. That sort of fits well. Well, pair it with intrinsic, and everybody will remember both easily, instantaneously. Anyway, aim at intrinsic value. If you come up with an idea and then decide to that the expression of that idea is the goal, then you will aim at that goal even if it turns out that it is not appropriate. And anyone can make mistakes and think that it's appropriate and then find out that they misjudged it. But it's a little bit different to, in second 2 of the other person's sentence, think that it looks appropriate to mention your knitting story. But then at second 10, it suddenly becomes clear that you're not in the context you thought you were. And although this solution has worked well for you in the context that you thought you were in, it would have worked, maybe. It's not going to work in the context that it turns out you're actually in. You know, at 10 seconds into their sentence, you know, they're like, it turned out knitting wasn't the point at all, and they're telling you, like, the story of XYZ, and if you just come back with the knitting thing, it may, well, there's a few things. One is, whether it goes well or not, has now become something of a matter of chance. Because you have now given up on finally differentiating your response to the context. At least to the context as much as you have access to it. You've gotten stuck on the context it looked like you were in 2 seconds into their sentence. And now, even though it turns out you're in another context, you're going to just proceed with the previous plan, recycling some old success story. That seems to me something like too specific. That kind of specificity in response, the part where you apparently feel like it's appropriate and valuable to share some story to amuse someone, in order to know that that's a good response, I think in a lot of contexts, that level of specificity will make more sense once you're already pretty finely synced up with someone. Once you're reasonably synced up with them, you might be able to, like, find extremely specific possible moves that genuinely seem appropriate to the circumstance, to the context, and to the level of synchronization that you've achieved. But when you're just starting out, you somehow need to you can't just shoot in the dark like that. When you're still quite unsynchronized, and it's not clear what the appropriate way to respond is, you don't yet want to respond with a finely differentiated strategy of any kind. At the level of fine differentiation, you want to stay you want to be appropriate to the context. So if the context is the other person is not yet, how am I articulating this? It's something like you want a match, okay? When you're looking at a really low resolution 240 image, you kind of want to respond in kind. They've given you a quite general opening. You give them a sort of general opening. And those general openings set the stage for a very slightly less general next move. Because each move very slightly shapes the context. It's a little bit like sculpting stone. And you know you want to get to the end of the sculpting process and have like a really cool statue with very fine details. But you can't just take a block of stone and start like carving the image of an eye that you think is going to be part of the end product, which you've already decided in advance is definitely going to be Poseidon. Now, you can do that, obviously. People do that all the time. But there's the more sort of synchronized process. You know, as I understand it, in like the before times or whatever, artists talked about this idea of the medium telling them how to do their work. The medium guiding their decisions, of them not knowing where they're going to end up with their art until the medium reveals it to them, like the block of wood tells them that it wants to be carved into a duck or a fish or whatever it may be. That sounds to me like an I-thou relationship, by the way. I wonder if this is what the systems orientation and people orientation are. This is actually the largest known difference between men and women. I think we're something like a standard deviation apart from each other, on average, obviously, with the men being more oriented toward systems and the women more toward people. I wonder if that somehow syncs up with the I-thou versus I-it relationship. Maybe men have a greater tendency to I-it relationship things, to interact with them as objects. They don't ask the object how to interact with it. Instead, they think they know how to interact with it, and then move it into the position that they believe is correct. And maybe people orientation is more of an I-thou relationship, where you're like letting the thing tell you how to interact with it. Anyway, the point is that I have this image anyway of you've got like a block of marble, you decided to carve it, and you know the first thing to do is to knock off the corners. You knock off the corners and you go from there. You knock off the new corners that result. Imagine we're using straight line cuts here, okay? And it goes from less and less blocky, and it becomes more and more round if we were just going literally all the corners off. But you have to knock the corners off a little. So you start with like 100% of the thing to like process. And instead of aiming somehow straight at Poseidon, you leave that for later. You don't aim at the like end result. Instead, you aim at the next little step in front of you. It's like limit the canvas available to you. I mean, I suppose that's sort of what you're doing when you diminish a block of stone. It is like a canvas. Maybe I should just use a canvas metaphor. Oh, anyway. That whole I-thou, I-it thing might have something to do with the tendency of men to objectify. That's sort of what I-it means, to make into an object. To sort of invite a thing to respond to your, like, already prepared conception of how you can interact with the object in a valuable way. If we then flip that around, you get some sort of unobjectification. You would get anthropomorphization. Maybe women anthropomorphize more? That would be an interesting study. Or more precisely, maybe people with higher people orientation and lower systems orientation anthropomorphize more. And people with higher systems orientation and lower people orientation objectify more or systematize more. And if I understand, these two orientations don't actually trade off against each other. They're not like opposite ends of one spectrum. They're two separate spectrums. And I think the idea is that you can be high on both or low on both. is unusual, but it's still something that happens. What happens if somebody has a high systems and high people orientation? Do they somehow anthropomorphize a lot and objectify a lot? I don't know. Anyway, what I'm trying to articulate is, you start with the marble, you have a block, you don't aim at the end ideal result. No, you aim at the very next step in the process. And once that step is completed, you have now constrained yourself. You knocked off pieces of the marble. They're never coming back. So you've limited the scope of options available to you now. You've limited your possibilities. And if in the next step you knock off something else around the edges, you've further limited the space. And as you continue in this process, you limit, in other words, you're throwing out. You're eliminating swaths of possible ways to interact in this specific context. The new context, being created step by step, live. And that does make it alive and organic and co-created. So the idea is, at the beginning of a conversation, you're going to kind of feel like you don't know what to do, and you'll only have broad, general, random, small talk things to say. And it's no, you do know what to do. Those are the things to do. One of those very broad ones. And the distinctions between those very broad answers are not trivial. They may be small in some cases, but they're not trivial. Each one shapes the available container. And as one constrains options, you then choose between the remaining options. You again work in generalities. You don't go from 1% done and then try to jump ahead to Poseidon now. No. You just say something slightly less general. You iterate this process, and if you keep going one step ahead and not looking ahead too far to the future, and not gripping, clenching, being attached to the plans that come to mind, which then no longer fit the context as it evolves. As you iterate this process, you'll constrain the available, the statue, the block of stone, or the canvas, more and more until the only options left to you are rather more specific. And here's sort of one of the punchlines. At this point, maybe you don't make Poseidon, right? Maybe some path in the road, one of those previous constraints that you applied, knocked off a few bits of marble, and now it doesn't really fit for the original image. The process has tied your hands in a certain sense. And this, I a little bit think this is what hypnosis is. I think a hypnotist establishes the context and then goes progressively narrowing the field of affordances available to someone. And then toward the later end of the process, the person can either violate the context and just say, nope, getting a new block of marble, I'm ignoring everything that we've sort of created together here. I'm ignoring the specifics of the context of the moment. I can do anything. We were acting like we constrained things. Nothing was constrained. Of course I could still tell you the story of the knitting thing anytime. I could walk up to a stranger on the street and just start yelling it at them. These options are available to us. Now the other person may not respond well. So the meaning of that action depends on the context. Whether it's a valuable action or not is not determined by the action, but by the context. All keys fit some lock. Some keys fit a lot of locks, and you want to collect those in case you come across those kinds of locks. But you're going to frequently encounter locks that are unique. In fact, on a deep level, every lock is unique. And yes, you can recycle the same key over and over again in a variety of situations, and yes, that kind of works. But you can could also fine-tune that key. So for the 1,000 locks it could have opened, you could create 1,000 versions of that key that also open the lock, but do so more precisely, more with greater grip on the surface of the lock, in the same way that a grip needs to be shaped to fit the thing that is going to be gripped, the handle. So, keys and locks, grips and handles. If you want to get a really great grip on something, you can't just keep recycling the same old grips. You have to look at each individual handhold and shape your grip. And that requires you to be creative and live. And as Bruce Lee would say, not still, but ready and watching and syncing up and using your eyes and your observation in general. And being sensitive to the way the context shapes itself. And seeing if you can work with that in a way that works for you as well, that doesn't violate the context. Because look, it's great that you're technically free and radically free, and at any moment you can tell that story about knitting if you really want to. Freedom is amazing, great. But that just means that you're free to take low-value actions sometimes. So, you want to use your freedom to take high-value actions. And that means accepting constraints, right? Are you violating your freedom if you squeeze your hand to grab a hammer? It's like, oh, I've been oppressed by the shape of the handle. I'm oppressed by the fact that instead of being free to wield a hammer with any grip, instead I am only able to wield the hammer if I shape my hand into certain grips. It's like, well, whatever. Maybe that's less freedom, but the acceptance of constraint is empowering when employed correctly. And the idea here is that when you start out in a conversation, you look at it like a blank canvas. You don't know how to go from here to a masterpiece, and you don't imagine a masterpiece at the end, and you don't think about the masterpiece. You look at the blank thing, and you become observant and ready to act at a moment's notice. And you're acting when you're watching, and you're acting when you're listening, and you're acting when it's your time to talk, and when it's your time to talk. If you act immediately, your intuition will often sort of pick up the context as it's been constrained so far and choose among the available options. It's your system 2 that has a tendency to remember the field of affordances available to you. Right? It's the system 2. I a little bit imagine that hypnotism mostly functions on the system 1, and maybe being able to be hypnotized is about whether or not you're willing to unclench from specific strategies. If you are potentially willing to take a strategy that works really well for you in a lot of circumstances, and then just not employ it when there seems to be a perfect moment to use it, well, that responsiveness to context, I suspect, is what makes you susceptible, if we want to use that word, to hypnosis. And indeed, I talked about how when you're intuitive, you act, and your intuition somehow sort of feels into the context as it's so far been shaped, and the action comes out often pretty appropriate to that context, which then further constrains it, and so forth, until you have an extremely finely differentiated context, unique in the history of the world, a special conversation. I didn't talk I didn't talk the way I talk in conversations. I talked in the way I talk with you. And I didn't even talk with you the way I talk with you. Even that's too abstract, too low granular. No, I talk to you right now the way that I talk to you right now, and not the way that I talk to you in general. I allow the person and the time and everything else to shape how I respond to that moment. And in fact, in the process of doing this, and in the process of acting quickly and intuitively, doesn't that a little bit resemble hypnosis? When you're in a super finely differentiated, connective context with someone, and you've co-created this unique conversational object. Let's stick with the conversation template. You've created this so far unique conversational object, and you're maybe going to proceed with that. And it a little bit drives you to proceed with it. Sometimes the moment is so right that it just happens. Like, why did you do that? And you're like, I didn't think about it, which means you acted intuitively, let's say. It's like your intuition is sort of hooked up to the context of the moment. Your system 2 analysis can free you from that context. Well, that's sort of the same way that your brain can free your hand from the oppressive constraints of what is necessary to grip a handle on an object like a hammer. But then the intuition, how do I say this? I mean, I basically already said it. I'm gesturing in this space of the sort of deeper and more connective, and the more in this moment you are with someone, the less you are in the world. The less the long-term, big-picture values of the world exist to you in such a moment. That is a trade-off, by the way. But it's an important one, because that's the only way to end up so finely differentiated. You can't get there by a system 2 analysis. The problem is too complicated. The brain isn't big enough. And if it were, then we just finally differentiate down as deeply as the big brain would allow us, and then run into the same roadblock, just at a finer differentiated level. Presumably that's what's already happened with, say, chimps. It's like, why can't the chimps do better? It's like, the brain is only so big, and you're like, oh great, we'll solve it, we'll make humans. And it's like, well sure, the humans are more differentiated than the chimps, context to context, but then they hit their limit, and the same thing happens if you get a bigger brain. You ultimately hit this border, which is, well, it's the border between order and chaos. It's the border between what all of your brain power has been able to think through and understand and put into place so that it is a self-sustaining order. You sort of systematized a piece of the world. You've elegantly captured, let's say, a mathematical formula that with sufficiently high fidelity tracks reality such that you can predictably get what you expect to get out of each situation. And then there's the chaos. It's the part where these are the situations you still don't quite know how to navigate successfully. Your old tools of order do not work on it, or at least you haven't found which ones would. And this is where we need to rely on intuition in the same way that we rely on peripheral vision rather than that tiny little high HD bit in the middle of our vision. I'm going to look for an elegant way to articulate this comparison. But, so the point is, when you're really finely differentiated, connected, etc., you're very in the moment, you're very in the context, and the context moves you. It informs your intuition, and your intuition responds to that. And your intuition doesn't want to break the scene. And yes, your system 2 analysis can do that, break you out of hypnosis, break you out of connection. That sounds a little bit familiar. System 2, sort of nerd, imbalanced types are sometimes accused of not knowing how to be connected because they keep violating the context, and that keeps the context from ever getting more finely differentiated from all the other contexts in which the nerd has repeated the same sentence, articulated the same model, whatever. But I guess I'll just say that there's this sort of interesting correspondence between that almost compulsory element of acting out the next scene and the drama of the connected context of the conversation you've been co-creating. And actually literal theater people do experience this, don't they? You can get caught up in an actor's role, and you don't even have to think about the next line. It comes out naturally, and it comes out with the flavor of natural. This is the difference between someone like, say, like a Marco Rubio speech. I always would have said something like, they're trying to be passionate, and you can kind of tell that it's put on. And it's like, how do you access that genuine expressiveness? And the answer is, that's an intuition. As long as you're trying to design your utterances, they're not going to come out with that sort of live expressiveness. They're always going to look designed. Well, they are. Now you compare that, on the other hand, to someone like Trump or Bernie, who seem to genuinely feel certain things that they say that they're feeling or act out that they're feeling. You buy it. Like, I think that's why some people say they trust Trump. I think a lot of them know perfectly well that, if he says there's 7 things in a certain place, they know that there may not be 7 things there. They don't trust him in that sense, and they know they don't. There's all kinds of people that they supposedly don't trust, who, if they say that there's 7 things over there, they all know that there's 7 things. But that's only one kind of trust, and it's not the important one as far as some people are concerned. The other kind of trust is this intuitiveness thing. It's this idea that you're not carefully designing your utterances. And because you're not carefully designing them, you can't, build and bake deception into them. You want to know why intuition feels more real? It's because you didn't think through your sentence or your utterance before you spoke it. And you did it anyway. You acted it out without knowing where it was going to take you. And if you're really speaking freely, imagine you're speaking fast, so fast that you basically can't design every utterance. If you're really speaking fast, then there's a good chance you might say something you may not want to have said, Now, the way to ape that is by a lot of practice. And this is sort of like the used car salesman. A lot of people who might see through Marco Rubio's sort of attempts at expressiveness might be fooled by the used car salesman, who speaks fast and smoothly, and it sort of has the veneer of having been intuitively generated utterances. But of course, in reality, what's simply going on is that it's well practiced. On the other hand, some people, a lot of people, Marco Rubio's done well for himself, obviously, but on the other hand, I don't think most people don't go around talking about what an amazing or expressive or emotional speaker he is. So there's a certain sense in which, he's sort of aping it with, practice and really well informed design considerations. And then some people like that. Some people feel that it sort of has an intuitiveness to it, even though it maybe doesn't. And other people don't. Whereas somebody like Bernie or Trump, they're genuinely, especially in the case of Trump, you can tell he's genuinely not thinking through what he's saying. Right? That explains a lot. It also explains his ability to be actually, interesting to watch. Look, as much as, Jimmy Carter, if you don't like Trump, you might like Jimmy Carter. He's a great guy, but, you want to go watch his speeches? Because I don't want to go watch Jimmy Carter's speeches. But Trump is interactive. He's dialogical. He can read a crowd, interact with a crowd live. He doesn't say this pre-prepared line at a pre-prepared moment because it's going to be right to say that, no matter how everything else leading up to that moment goes. It's no. Depending on how things go leading up to that moment, Trump will respond on the moment. And, 15% of the time an intuitively generated thing comes out pretty silly, and then you've got all the fodder you need for criticism. And yet, you'll actually be somewhat interesting to watch. I think even people who don't like Trump would agree that he's more engaging to watch. Let's say engaging, because a deep negative experience, well, it is engaging, even if it's not exactly positive. Whereas, Jimmy Carter will just bore you. So, oh my goodness, I had this thought today, which is, I was listening to an audiobook with Kat that talked about two theories of the evolution of the nervous system, or maybe the brain. It said one theory was sensory motor. That seems so obviously true that you don't even question it, probably. But the other idea was the synchronization of action inside the organism. That it's sort of there like in Ben-Hur, there's that guy pounding the drum while the rowers row to keep the rowers on time, because that's very important, the synchronization. And it's like, look at a skillful, intuitive person interact with an audience. It's like they're a little bit like that drummer. They sort of put something out to the audience, and the audience sort of understands what's sort of being presented to them. They react and you react to them, and now they know that what they do can affect. It's an interactive experience. What they do can affect. And that only works at the group level. If the individual cheers or boos, doesn't make that much difference. But if the whole crowd cheers or boos, now you can have this really fun interactive experience. So you a little bit want to express yourself, yes, but you also want to react like one of the top 1 or 2 ways that probably everyone else is going to react, in the hopes that you can sort of contribute to a voice that will be heard and responded to. And now you're becoming synchronized with each other, right? You're rowing in time. And this sounds a lot like pacing and leading, which is I think it's a standard hypnosis idea. You're pacing the audience. That's when you're syncing up with them. That's early stages. You respond to them. You establish that dialogue, that back and forth, that to-be-determinedness of the next moment, because you've communicated to the audience that you're not necessarily going to say a certain thing at a certain time. They can change what you'll end up saying, even if only in the clumsiest way. It's still interactive, and that makes it interesting. And in fact, it makes it much more interesting than participating, such as it is, remotely, not as part of the crowd. You don't participate in the creation of the performance, let's say. Yeah, imagine a conductor conducting and the audience is invited to express themselves a bit, and they gasp in a moment, and he he looks over his shoulder, and the audience gives a little laugh, and they're like, oh, it's interactive now. And then he conducts the music slightly differently, and as people react, he reacts. And he gets quiet. When they get suddenly quiet, he does some sort of response to it. Maybe he gets quiet. That's pacing. When they get loud, he gets loud. That's pacing. You do this, or you run this a few times, and then they're basically moderate, and you get loud, and they'll have a tendency to follow you now. So now you're leading. That's a hypnosis move. But I suspect that hypnosis is basically just a specialized way of interacting with the same sort of intuitive space, this dialogical space, this created live responsiveness to the moment, that organicness, and liveness is a good word for it, because when you're 2 seconds in, it was alive to you to share that knitting story, and then 10 seconds in, it turns out they're talking about something completely different, and then you share the knitting story anyway, it's dead. It's dead. The person becomes a little bit less engaged, maybe, probably. And I've even found that I find myself in conversational contexts where, we get on some fine point, oh, did you mean this? And they're like, oh, like that? and like I'm confused about their clarification, and like we get in these nested confusions, and at some point it just feels dead to me. It's just like I just don't want to like answer this question. I feel like trapped by the fact that, you know, I was asking a clarifying question and that was hard to understand, so you clarified, but that unfortunately was actually also unclear to me, so then I clarified back at this like new meta level, and now the confusion's like spiraling or hydrating, and now I've been invited to take an action to provide a certain piece of information. It's like, did you mean X when you used the word blue? And it's like, it just feels dead to me. And I think what I'm sensing, my intuition is sensing. See, my system 2 sees a good logic. My system 2, maybe that's wrong. I'm going to leave out the systems here, because I'm maybe a bit confused on this point. But the point is, some part of you feels that this is dead, and it's right. Because you've formed a grip that does not fit the handle. And you need to, like, detach from the momentum of the moment. Zoom back out, resync at a less finely grained level because you failed at the fine grained level. And then get back, if you can, step by step, back into more and more fine synchronization. I mean, this occurs at the level of conversations. It also occurs at the level, probably, of relationships across years. However, not answering the question when they're like very clear, and there's a context in which there's a certain logic to why it would make sense for you to now decide, out of all the billion affordances technically available to you, that you're going to share with this person what it was that you had in mind at moment X in history and space. When you use the word blue, it's like, nope, this is not the affordance that I want to take. One part of me, it feels carried away by the momentum. That sounds a little bit like hypnosis. It sounds a little bit like what happens when you do get synced up too, doesn't it? Synced up. You're synced up in some way. That's a little bit of a mystery. I'll have to think that one through. Something like, what is the type of compulsion you're feeling in a moment when the like, I don't know how to what the word is exactly, but when the logic of the conversation says to output an action, it's like when you ask a question, the other person is supposed to answer that question. That's the context. That's the momentum. That's the proposal, the bid that they are handing you, and you're supposed to take it. And not taking it is a little bit like somebody reaching out to hand you a thing and you just standing there instead of accepting it. And there's a certain compulsion that says, no, take it. But when that happens because of sentences, because of, how to say this, because of the logic of the like official rules of conversation, the logic that has rules like when you ask a question, you're supposed to give an answer. When that logic tells you to answer, but like some other part of you knows that we've just sort of ended up here by accident because we were following the rules of conversation. I clarified, but you misunderstood tonight. You're supposed to clarify. You know, that's what you do. You misunderstand, so you clarify. And now it's nested a bunch of levels, and now we've ended up somewhere asking about a very specific piece of information, and there's a logic to it, but also if you zoom out and like actually look at what's valuable available to you, this is not the affordance you are looking for. So I'm going to have to puzzle that out. What's the difference between the type of compulsion that comes from like following those like sentence conversation rules, and what is the kind of compulsion that comes from when you're like finally synced up to a moment and feel the momentum carry you along to play your part in the play? It seems like one is about you are synced up to something in the dead case. In the clarifying question case, you're just synced up to the wrong thing. That's something to think about later. But there seems to me to be a continuity in the type of compulsion that exists in hypnosis, in ritual, in like participatory, organic crowd, like speeches to crowds or performances to crowds of other kinds. And in like really well-connected conversations when you're feeling connected to someone and you don't want to break the context that you've co-created, and it feels forbidden to do certain things in that context because the context points, very much in another direction. Well, maybe that's it for now.